In a new 4-week-long miniseries, I hope to bring up some of the spookier lore across the Warhammer world. We'll be delving into haunted places, cursed lords, and an army at the thrall of vampires and other kind of October-y themed goodness for you guys. Our video today will discuss one of the oldest characters and antagonists of the Warhammer lore, Constant Drachenfels. From a time around 1st and 2nd editions, Drachenfels' name has echoed across the many years, weaving in and out of various publications, White Dwarfs, and even video games such as Vermintide. But who was this character? What are his origins? Where did his tale ultimately end? Today we'll explore the grand tale of the great Enchanter. Before we dive headlong into the lore of this character, there are some canonical issues that I'd like to bring up. For one, Drachenfels predates a lot of the established lore existing in the later 80s and early 90s. He follows a lot of the early high fantasy RPG tropes of some grand evil necromancer, demon pack-making, crazed lunatic in a spooky castle through perilous forests and mountains. Drachenfels' character had been thrown to the wayside for many years, with mentions more of his castle than of the individual himself. There are only 3 books ever published about this character, but due to their popularity, they have been reprinted 1 or 2 times. In addition, they went on to influence the books of the vampire Genevieve. And it truly wasn't until the end times that Warhammer fans got a button on this story, but we'll get into that later. For now, let's get started. Our story begins in the earliest portions of the lore, well before the coming of the Old Ones. Drachenfels himself regards this as a time, quote-unquote, before the Toadmen came from the stars, also giving a nod to an ice age that the planet had been going through. Constant Drachenfels was a member of a proto-human tribe some 15,000 years in the distant past. As the tale goes, he was left to die in his old age, far off in the wilderness. There, he feigned his own death until a member of his tribe came to investigate. When the tribesmen touched Drachenfels, the old man somehow completely leached the life force of the other, extending his life preternaturally. This, however, did not aid his body, which continued to rot in his old, disgusting, haggard age. So Drachenfels did what any sane individual did, and took body parts from those that he drew the life of so that he might look like some patchwork form of a human. Essentially, he'd jump from body to body, preserving the faces of the individuals he liked the most to be used as masks. Now, a lot of this predates magic, but the great Enchanter was still able to hone his magical abilities. He actually even used magic to preserve the masks or faces of these individuals. During the collapse of the Polar Gates and the subsequent end of the Great Catastrophe, it is said that Drachenfels met the great Chaos Gods themselves, and was left unimpressed. The Chaos Gods seemed to look upon Drachenfels as an equal in some regard, and also jealous of his abilities. This kind of leaves a lot to be discussed, but I think I'll save those thoughts, I guess you could say, for after the video, when we discuss some of the quote-unquote lore holes, as I'll call them. And I apologize if there seems like a disjointed bit of continuity to the story, but it is the unfortunate circumstance the way Drachenfels has been preserved over the many years of the Warhammer lore. Which is to say that this character spent 15 or so years in total obscurity before being, I guess, rehashed by some authors here and there. Either way, Drachenfels eventually created a castle with his namesake deep within the Grey Mountains. 7 long spires jutted out from the very bedrock of the mountain, an indomitable fortress that would overlook the old world from its haunted and grim mountaintop. From this castle, Drachenfels lashes out aimlessly against the outside world. He rarely has any kind of real aim, not like, say, Manfred wanting to take the throne of Altdorf for himself, or Nagash wanting to turn the world into a realm of death. Nay, Drachenfels' motivations are typically singular and sadistic in their nature, merely looking to torture or kill people out of boredom than some agenda. The first time we see Drachenfels enter the, I guess, kind of current timeline, or the timeline as we know it, is when Sigmar rallies his fledgling empire against the many hosts of greenskins throughout the old world. Uniting the tribes of man, Sigmar put all of the orc war bosses of the area to the sword, carving the grand empire from the blood of both orc and human alike. One army comprised primarily of goblins lay at the foothills of the Grey Mountains. Rumored to have been led by a human, Sigmar went to end this plight upon his empire. At the time, Sigmar had also fought against the great necromancer Nagash, and Drachenfels was allied with him. The two armies met on the battlefield, a dark host of goblins and a grand army of tribesmen led by Sigmar. Battling through the horde of disgusting, groveling, chittering little creatures. I hate goblins. Oh god, I fucking hate goblins. Sigmar made his way to the mighty Drachenfels. Here stood a man well above 6 feet tall, an elaborate mask hiding his face, with piercing red eyes glaring from the mask, fine robes cast around his body. Their duel was quick and swift as Sigmar slew the great Enchanter, putting the army to rout and ending the terror from the castle deep within the Grey Mountains. But that would not be the last people heard of this ancient terror. By some fell magic, Castle Drachenfels slowly reconstituted its cursed master, constant Drachenfels coming back to life deep within the bowels of his mighty holdfast. In 1854 IC, some 1800 years or so after his initial banishment, Drachenfels was seen amongst the living once more, this time at the head of an army comprised of undead and demons. Moving through Athel-Loren and into the lands of Bretonnia, he attacked the lands of Paravan. Sieging the capital city itself and killing every defender, he took the ruling family hostage and ransomed them against the people of Paravan for their release. Upon payment, he had the family as well as the ruling nobles executed, taking the riches back with him to the castle Drachenfels. One of those nobles, as just a kind of a little aside here, was actually the father of the famous vampire Genevieve. Well, the soon-to-be famous vampire Genevieve. A scant amount of time later, a few decades really, Drachenfels presented himself to the Empire, seeking to repent for his sins. The money he took from Paravan he used to pay reparations to all the families he had hurt during his time as a tyrant through the lands of the Old World. He then threw himself at the graves of those that he had tortured and killed, seen publicly crying and asking for their forgiveness. So you get this kind of grand altruistic act from Drachenfels. Well, maybe not altruistic, but one of repentance, of a man that has realized the error of his ways, and did all within his power to right his many wrongs. He had rebuilt his image so much so that he had earned the trust of the emperor of the time, Emperor Carolus. Inviting the entire imperial court to his palace as a grand gesture, he ordered a feast to be held in the name of the empire. Many elector counts were present with their families or at least sons in tow. There, each guest was served wine as music was played and much merrymaking was to be had. If, of course, the wine wasn't laced with paralytic poison that froze the entire attending party save for Drachenfels himself. But you've heard of the Red Wedding in Game of Thrones, right? Well, Warhammer remembers this moment as the Poison Feast. Drachenfels then tortured and killed each guest's sons in front of their very eyes. All who attended remained locked in their banquet chairs, with a full feast before them as they all slowly starved to death. Drachenfels is really a swell guy, you know, if you haven't gotten the full measure of his sadistic behavior. Having effectively destroyed the entirety of the Empire's ruling structure, he did nothing. He just wanted the joy from all of it. He just wanted to see people, their sons get killed, and then to watch them slowly starve to death as he ate food in front of them. So, he's a pretty crazy son of a bitch. One of the only children to escape the poison feast was Oswald von Königswald. He, like his father before him, became an elector count and put together a small group of adventurers to take Drachenfels' head. A dwarf, a brigand, an assassin, and Genevieve, who no one knew was a vampire at the time. In 2480 IC, they made their way up the Grey Mountains to the castle of Drachenfels. Storming the castle itself, the group was able to slay the great Enchanter, with Oswald landing the killing blow, banishing the servants of darkness from the realm once more. Oswald then took up residence after his army destroyed every member of Drachenfels garrison. What no one knew was that at the time of this great duel between Oswald and Drachenfels, a deal was struck. Most of the members of the adventuring party had been wounded or waylaid in other parts of the castle, but Oswald was promised power and the title of slaying Constant in exchange for not outright killing Drachenfels himself. So, for 20-some-odd years, Oswald ruled from the castle in relative peace. He had commissioned the famous actor and playwright Detlef Sierck to create a play about the heroic acts of Oswald's defeat of Drachenfels. This play was to be presented to the imperial court with Emperor Karl Franz and his son, Prince Luitpold, in attendance. The play started off magnificently, a grand spectacle for all to be watched, until Drachenfels possessed the lead actor at the climax of the play. Destroying all in his path, the vampire Genevieve, who was in attendance at the play, and Detlef combined their strength to slay Drachenfels once and for all. And thus the story of Drachenfels fell into obscurity through the many years after the Oswald's grand fuck-up, until the advance of the end times. And to spare a huge segue, I'll go into the finer points and details of this journey through this pretty tumultuous pit of lore. So Nagash resurrects a powerful enchanter that had recently been banished in the Grey Mountain. His name is, well, the Nameless. In exchange for the Nameless's services, Nagash promises to restore his name and memory. Nameless thus becomes one of Nagash's Mortarchs, exacting his will across the land. Teaming up with Vlad von Karstein, they are responsible for holding a huge swath of the Auric Bastion and keeping it from falling. Unbeknownst to Vlad, the Nameless was possessing the men around him, willing them to stay and fight despite their fear. But over time, his sadistic nature bled through, and he started to have the men flay each other or fight in large gladiatorial battles or erect giant banners of bone and skin only the next morning to kill one another over them. With Vlad's departure from Nagash's services, Gelt's fall to necromancy, and the subsequent crumbling of the Auric Bastion, the Nameless was free to pursue his own ends. He then allied with the Demons of Chaos and fully possessed Luther Huss, the Herald of Sigmar. Allying with Isabella von Karstein, who had been corrupted by Nurgle, they launched an invasion into Sylvania. Using his grand powers, the Nameless possessed and controlled all of Manfred's massive undead army, resulting in Manfred, Luther Harkon, and Vlad all being holed up in an inn called the Dead and Buried, the undead shambling and knocking at the walls, seeking to end the Mortarchs. And for those of you who don't know, those three are actually Mortarchs of Nagash. Sallying forth, Harkon and the von Karsteins fought against the Nameless's horde, Vlad engaging in single combat with the possessed Luther Huss. He taunted the Herald rather than seeking to overpower the Nameless. Chiding Luther, he questioned his faith and challenged the might of Sigmar. This, of course, awoke Luther, who was able to purify himself using the holy light of Sigmar from the inside out, completely eradicating the Nameless in the process. It's worth noting that there are times during the Auric Bastion where Vlad openly taunts the Nameless, saying that he knows who he is and that this is a massive fall from grace for who the Nameless actually is, which will lead nicely into our next little section here. And we talked briefly about this in the beginning, but there are a number of conflicts that arise with the story of Drachenfels as a whole. It was hotly contested through the last 20 or so years that Drachenfels' story had fallen out of canonical lore and was no longer relevant to the world that was created in latter editions of Warhammer Fantasy. For one, the age of Drachenfels seems to conflict with the notion that the Old Ones created humans. That is to say that there is also a passage that suggests that the Old Ones didn't simply create the humans, but more elevated them from primordial to at least the tribal races prior to Sigmar's unification. I guess it really just depends on which point in the lore you want to take as fact as it pertains to the Old Ones and their creation of all the fledgling and earlier races. For a lot of what we know, the Old Ones, there were a very few amount of races that were present on the world when the Old Ones arrived, and most of those races are all reptilian in some way or shape or form. But when we also look at items such as the Sword of Cain, we see an item of immense power that is supposed to predate the Old Ones as well. Like, they talk about how it was there before time was time. And that sort of gives credence to a possible pre-Old Ones Drachenfels. Another contested point, or point of contention, is Drachenfels' use and mastery of magic prior to magic's wide use by even the Lizardmen. Which is interesting, as that might hint that the warp gates were always pouring winds of magic into the world, and the Old Ones just knew how to hone or at least tap into it. It's really hard for me to really draw a distinction of how Drachenfels really falls into the lore, and what credence to give to his overall story. I mean, I could honestly make this section an entire video within itself, so I don't want to go too deep down the rabbit hole of canon conflicts, because the dates are also hotly contested. But the End Times never explicitly says that the Nameless is Drachenfels, simply that he's a great enchanter from the Grey Mountains that was recently banished. This is really the only recent indication of Drachenfels the individual versus Drachenfels the location in the lore. I mean, after his publications and Vampire Genevieve, Drachenfels for the most part is just an obscure reference, mainly by his location, Castle Drachenfels, than by the actual Grand Enchanter, Necromancer, Demon, Pack-wielding Greenskin leader that he is in the lore. In conclusion, though, Drachenfels represents a very old portion of the Warhammer lore. For the nostalgic, he also represents a very simple time in high fantasy, where mismatched groups of adventurers would range across many environs to slay some grand evil necromancer demon wizard hybrid vampire. And we've seen the Castle Drachenfels added to Total War Warhammer, and mentions of him through happenings and events through the game, but a lot of people have asked me if I ever see him as a lore that could possibly be added to the game. And I unfortunately have to say no. Unless they wanted to create an end times hybrid greenskin vampire undead demon army, then I think that Drachenfels will always remain what he has always been. A terrifying figure of the more mythological portions of the Warhammer lore. A sinister image of power without ends and goals unfathomable that has been the scourge of the old world for centuries. I want to thank you guys so much for joining me here today, as always. If you have any questions or comments about Drachenfels himself, you want to make a hard claim as to why you think he is in the canon, or you want to make a hard claim against it, or if you want to talk about some of the other publications that he is showcased in, like some of the White Dwarfs and stuff like that, please by all means let me know in the comments below. This was a video that I was going to do last year, but I found just so many different conflicting viewpoints about it that I kind of steered clear of it. And I think in this video I managed to somehow get the gist of what we know to be quote-unquote lore fact. Again, a lot of the dates are contested and so on and so forth, but a good gist of who this character is. Because I think he does play a really important role in the kind of underarching theme of Drachenfels and Castle Drachenfels and the old world and this kind of cosmic, maybe not cosmic, but sort of grand antagonist to the world that really isn't allied with anyone. It's like the antithesis to a Tom Bombadil in Lord of the Rings. Like, he's super powerful and he could end anything at any moment, but he just kind of doesn't, because he doesn't want to do it. It's kind of a weird little dichotomy you have with constant Drachenfels. But I hope you enjoyed this video here today, and it gave you a nice little foray into some spookier lore about the Warhammer world. If you have any suggestions about things you'd like to see this month, by all means let me know. I've got it pretty well calendared out to go every Tuesday for the next week, but I can also squeeze videos in here and there if there's something that really kind of catches my eye. But as always, guys, thank you so much for watching here today. Have a good one, and take care.